The morning sun cast a gentle light over Jackson High School as students filed in, their conversations filled with talk of the upcoming midterm exams. It was an anxious time for everyone, but for one student in particular, this day would prove life-altering. Jamal Robinson sat at his desk in room 203, trying to focus on the history midterm in front of him. His mind was sharp, and the material wasn't particularly difficult. After all, Jamal was one of the best students in his year, despite being one of the few black students in a mostly white, affluent school. But there was something different about today. A gnawing feeling that things were about to go wrong. In front of the classroom stood Mr. Willard, a tall, thin man in his 50s with a perpetual scowl etched across his face. Mr. Willard had been a fixture at the school for over 2 decades, known for his strictness and harsh demeanor. For many students, he was just another tough teacher, but for Jamal, there had always been something more beneath the surface of his interactions with Mr. Willard, a subtle, almost invisible layer of disdain. Jamal couldn't quite explain it, but it was always there, lurking beneath every conversation, every look. Jamal had worked hard to overcome the expectations people had placed on him. His parents had moved the family to this district for the better schools, hoping it would give Jamal more opportunities. But the move hadn't come without its challenges. Jackson High was prestigious, yes, but it was also a place where Jamal constantly felt like an outsider. Being one of the few black students at the school, he was always aware of the eyes on him, always aware that he had to be better, work harder, and prove himself in ways that others didn't. The midterm was supposed to be another step toward his dream of getting into a top university. He had spent the last week studying late into the night, going over every detail in his notes. But as he worked through the questions on the test, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The classroom was silent, except for the sound of pencils scratching against paper and the occasional rustle of pages turning. Mr. Willard patrolled the room like a hawk, eyes scanning each student with suspicion. When he reached Jamal's desk, he slowed, staring at the young man. Jamal felt the weight of Mr. Willard's gaze, but he didn't look up. He was focused on the final question of the exam, determined to get it right. But then, Mr. Willard's voice broke the silence, sharp and accusatory. "Jamal, what is this?" Mr. Willard's voice rang out, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He looked up in confusion, only to see Mr. Willard pointing at a small piece of paper on the floor next to his desk. It was a crumpled scrap, but it was noted for the exam. Jamal blinked in disbelief. That wasn't his. He hadn't even noticed it there. I don't know, sir," Jamal stammered. "That's not mine." Mr. Willard's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Really? You expect me to believe that? You think you can cheat in my class and get away with it? Stand up, now." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. All eyes were on Jamal as he slowly stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the judgment of his classmates, their stares burning into his back. His hands were trembling, but he clenched his fists to steady them. As Jamal stood in the middle of the classroom, Mr. Willard loomed over him, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've had my suspicions about you for a while, Jamal. You're a smart kid, but I always wondered how you did so well on these exams. Now I know." Jamal's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. "I didn't cheat," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I studied for this exam. That paper isn't mine." Mr. Willard shook his head slowly, a look of cold disappointment on his face. "Save it. You're coming with me to the principal's office. You'll be suspended immediately." The walk to the principal's office felt like a nightmare for Jamal. Each step was heavy, as if the weight of the accusation was physically pressing down on him. His mind raced. This wasn't just about a test. If he was suspended, it would go on his record, and colleges would see it. His dreams of attending a prestigious university would be shattered. Jamal's parents were called to the school, and the meeting with the principal, Mrs. Dawson, was scheduled for the following morning. Jamal spent the rest of the day at home, staring blankly at his textbooks, knowing that everything he had worked for could be taken away in an instant. His mother, Angela Robinson, was furious when she found out. She knew her son. She knew how hard he worked, how much he cared about his education. She had always told Jamal that he would have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good, but this was different. This wasn't about effort. This was about prejudice. The next morning, Jamal and his parents arrived at the principal's office. Mrs. Dawson, a stern woman in her late 40s, sat behind her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Mr. Willard was already there, looking smug and confident. The evidence was clear, he thought. Jamal had been caught with cheat notes, and that was all there was to it. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. and Mrs. Robinson," Mrs. Dawson began, her voice formal. "As you know, Jamal has been accused of cheating on his history midterm." Mr. Willard found a piece of paper with notes related to the exam near his desk. Angela Robinson's eyes flashed with anger. "My son didn't cheat," she said firmly. "He doesn't need to cheat. He's one of the top students in his class." Mr. Willard scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Top student or not, the evidence speaks for itself. The paper was right there next to his desk. How do you explain that?" Jamal, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "It wasn't mine," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Someone else must have put it there." Mrs. Dawson raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any proof of that, Jamal?" Jamal hesitated. He didn't have proof, but something inside him told him that this wasn't just a random accusation. Someone had wanted him to get in trouble. "What about the security cameras?" Jamal asked, his voice growing more confident. "There's one outside the classroom that might have caught someone planting the paper near my desk." Mr. Willard's face tightened, but he said nothing. Mrs. Dawson looked intrigued. "That's a good point," she said. "We'll review the footage and see if there's anything on it." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as they waited for the footage to be retrieved. Jamal's heart raced. If the camera didn't show anything, his chances of clearing his name would be slim. But he had to believe that the truth would come out. When the footage finally arrived, what they saw shocked everyone in the room. The grainy black and white footage showed the classroom just before the test began. Students were settling into their seats, and Mr. Willard was at his desk. Then, a student, Ryan Matthews, one of the most popular and well-connected boys in school, casually walked past Jamal's desk. As he did, he slipped a piece of paper onto the floor next to Jamal's chair, before continuing to his seat as if nothing had happened. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He had been telling the truth all along. Mrs. Dawson's face was stony as she turned to Mr. Willard. "It seems there's been a serious mistake," she said, her voice cold. "Jamal is innocent." Mr. Willard's face flushed with embarrassment, but instead of admitting his mistake, he tried to deflect. I didn't see it. How was I supposed to know?" Mrs. Dawson's expression hardened. "That's not the point, Mr. Willard. The point is that you jumped to conclusions without proper evidence. You unfairly targeted Jamal, and that's unacceptable." Angela Robinson, who had been quiet up until now, couldn't hold back any longer. "This isn't just about a piece of paper," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This is about how you've been treating my son, and other students like him, since the beginning of the year. Jamal has told me about how you single him out in class, how you question him more harshly than the others. It's clear that you've had it out for him from the start." Mr. Willard stiffened. "That's not true," he said defensively. "I treat all my students the same." But Mrs. Dawson wasn't convinced. She opened a folder on her desk and glanced at the papers inside. "Actually, Mr. Willard, we've received several complaints about your treatment of minority students. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." The room fell into a tense silence. Jamal's mother shot a triumphant look at Mr. Willard, but Jamal felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had known for a long time that something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that there were others who had been treated like him, made the situation feel even heavier. As the meeting continued, the full extent of the situation began to unravel. Mrs. Dawson's investigation revealed that Ryan Matthews, the student who had planted the paper, was the son of a wealthy donor to the school. His family had been influential in the school's development, and Ryan had been given preferential treatment on more than one occasion. Ryan had planted the paper because he knew he could get away with it. He had seen how Mr. Willard treated students like Jamal, and knew that, in this environment, a black student like Jamal would be more likely to be blamed than someone like him. It was a calculated move, and it almost worked. The revelation caused an uproar within the school. Parents, teachers, and students alike were shocked to learn that this kind of discrimination had been happening under their noses. The local media picked up the story, and soon Jackson High School became the center of a heated controversy. In the end, Mr. Willard was suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct, and Ryan Matthews faced disciplinary action for his role in the incident. The school board promised to overhaul their policies regarding discipline and fairness, vowing to make the school a more equitable place for all students. Jamal returned to school a week later, but things weren't the same. Many of his classmates treated him differently, some with newfound respect, others with quiet disdain. He had exposed a deep-rooted problem within the school, and not everyone was happy about it. But Jamal didn't care about the whispers or the sideways glances. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had forced the school to confront its own biases. He had always known that being one of the few black students at Jackson High would come with challenges, but now, more than ever, he understood that some fights were worth having. The incident at Jackson High became a rallying point for other students and parents, sparking discussions about race, privilege, and fairness in schools across the district. And while the battle wasn't over, Jamal knew that he had taken an important step toward creating a more just environment for himself and those who would come after him. This extended version of the story dives deeper into the structural issues of racial bias in educational institutions. It not only focuses on the unfair treatment of individual students, but also exposes how privilege and influence can protect the guilty while punishing the vulnerable. The story leaves readers with a reflection on how systemic racism manifests in unexpected places, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the system is stacked against you.